Hi, friends. Welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. You join me today in our entire journey through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And today we're continuing our series of studies through the Gospel of Luke. It's the time of year where the sun's now arrived at the window here at my side early in the morning, so I'm no longer able to have the curtains drawn. Otherwise, it's just a massive glare behind me. So unfortunately, all you've got to look at is me today, but we'll press on regardless. Please remember, if you're here for the first time, then click on the subscribe button. That way you'll always get notification when a new episode appears, and you'll be able to make the decision to make the study, the in-depth study of the Word of God, part of the rhythm of our daily lives together. And with that said, we'll leave it there, but hang on at the end and I'll update you and tell you a few ways you can connect with the ministry. Bye-bye for now. Okay, here we are today. Luke chapter 14. We're going to look at the first 14 verses and at the discussion that Jesus has with some Pharisees again. You know, it seems to me that we've almost lost the art of sitting down together and having meals together as families and talking to each other. A lot of people eat in front of the television nowadays. When I grew up, mealtime conversations were often the most significant conversations I would have in a day. I think I would say that some of the most deeply significant conversations I've had in life have actually occurred over food. So that led me to wonder what it would be like to have dinner with Jesus. Suppose he was sitting at the table with you, what would it be like? Suppose you invited him over to your house for dinner and that there were other guests. How would that conversation go? How do you think it might go? Would it just be a chit chat or would it be something else? Would Jesus make mealtime conversations as important? Would Jesus want to make the mealtime conversation an important time to discuss important things? Well, thankfully, we don't have to guess about this, friends, because we have several illustrations of just this very thing happening for us in Scripture. And one of these in particular is described in some detail for us in this passage in Luke. So today we're going to cover the first 13, 14 verses of Luke, and I'm going to work through it in little bite-sized chunks. We'll take a couple of verses together, we'll consider what I feel what they're trying to tell us, an exposition, and then I'll try and draw the whole thing together at the end with some conclusions and observations. So let's pick up with Luke 14 verses 1 to 3, which tells us this. One Sabbath, when Jesus went in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts of the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" Now, just a very simple reading of this passage, friends, obviously indicates that this occasion that we're looking at is a meal, like I've described. But if we take a closer look at the conversations that are going on, we can see that all sorts of dynamics are playing out in this situation. It says at the beginning he's in the house of one of the rulers, the leaders, a leading Pharisee, an influential, a prominent figure, maybe a ruler of a synagogue, but anyway, he's there and he's going to eat bread, actually, it says on the Sabbath, referring to eating a meal. Now, apparently at the point this conversation begins, we don't need to read it that they were necessarily seated at the table. They're just gathering together in the house prior to eating. And we're told that this house that they're in is the house of a rather influential person. He might indeed have been a member of the Sanhedrin, but at very least he's a leading Pharisee in this town that Jesus has visited on his way to Jerusalem. At any rate, he's in the house of a prominent guy, a Pharisee, and it's the Sabbath day. All that information is given to us in the opening verses, and it says that the people there are watching him closely. Now, if all we had was that verse, we might assume that the ones watching him again as we've seen in the past, were the Pharisees. And yes, that's true. But when you read the whole passage, you can see that others are scrutinizing him as well at this point. If we drop down to verse 3, we see Jesus is answering, and it says he speaks to the lawyers and the Pharisees. So there's more than just Pharisees there. There's these guys, the finicky lawyers, those that are often described as the scribes. But verse 1 says that whoever is there is watching him closely. Now, the original word used here for watching is a word that can be better described as they're examining him. Some would say examining him with the implication of finding some fault with him. The word has a suggestion of critically examining him. And it tells us that this man comes before him, and he has what the King James Bible called dropsy, an old-fashioned word, but a word that describes a very painful disease that led at that time and still, when untreated today, leads to extreme swelling of the body. And a person like that would be suffering terribly. And also worth noting that he's not the sort of person who would normally be invited to a dinner, certainly not with a prominent Pharisee, maybe a ruler of a synagogue. Someone like that would not have been allowed to participate in such a social events. So the suggestion, quite reasonably it seems to me, have been made by some Bible experts that the Pharisees had in fact planted this guy there because they knew or they suspected what Jesus might do in this situation. They knew that Jesus might possibly heal them. So they planted this guy so that they could get him, accuse him of healing on the Sabbath. And prior to this occasion, of course, the Lord had healed many times. In fact, if I'm counting correctly, he's done at least 7 miracles already up to this point in the gospel. So why not today? Why not this occasion? So it's not the first time he's done this sort of thing. And sure enough, Jesus, when he sees this guy, he immediately turns to the lawyers and the Pharisees, probably knowing what was going on in their mind and what they'd planned and plotted in this situation. And he asks them a straightforward question. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Okay, let's examine their response in the next couple of verses, verses 4 to 6. But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, if one of you has a child, or an ox even, that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? And they had nothing to say. Okay, what was their response? Silence. That's the one good thing they did. The question put them on the horns of a dilemma, you see, because if they said yes, it was okay to heal in the Sabbath, then they would be breaking the Sabbath, or at least acknowledging that it could be broken according to their rules that they suggested applied. And if they said no, well, that would appear to be very heartless, wouldn't it, towards this sick person? So they took probably the only route, certainly the wisest route that they could have taken on this occasion, which is they simply shut up. And may I suggest, friends, that sometimes is the best course of action for us too. Sometimes, when responded with difficult situations, sometimes we're better just saying nothing. And then he says to them, look, you guys, if you had a donkey or an ox fall into a ditch, wouldn't you pull it out? Now, as a matter of fact, this was a common occurrence, so much so that the law that they had driven up, the scribes had written up the additional oral traditions that had followed on from the law, the written law delivered to Moses, allowed for a very situation just as this. So he's asking them, would it be lawful for them to do such a thing? And they, of course, would have to say yes to those particular circumstances that he's quoting, because they had scribed caveats that would allow for that. So sure enough, Jesus then says, well, for no other reason than this man was sick and needed to be healed. And because of the fact, of course, he has compassion on him, then he goes ahead and heals him. Now that puts their situation in direct juxtaposition, opposition, you might say, to what Jesus has just done. They know in the situation that he's just described for them, it's perfectly normal, acceptable to take an animal that has fallen into a ditch, to take out of the ditch. Sometimes their motivation for doing that might just be selfish. The best you could say about it was to prevent the animal from suffering, but more often than not, it was probably written into the law to cover the potential loss of profit from an animal if it died in such a situation. Yet Jesus here has someone who's struggling and on the Sabbath, and what is his response is to heal a sick man. So clever, isn't it? In examining their response in verse 4, they're silent, which was a prudent move from their point of view, because Jesus had his questioning of them had placed them in an intractable dilemma. If they said yes, then they would be breaking the Sabbath, or at least acknowledging that it could be broken according to their rules. And if they said no, they were being cold and heartless and not expressing God's love for a very sick man. So Jesus here cleverly has highlighted the inconsistency in their actions of being willing to rescue an animal for personal gain, yet objecting the rescuing and healing of a person because nothing more than legalistic concerns about what should and should not be done on the Sabbath. That was the excuse. Let's move on in the text. Verse 7. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them a parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor for a person more distinguished than you, who may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come to you and say, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the less important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he says to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So Jesus here offers a piece of advice, spiritual advice, based out of the very things he's just witnessed as these people were gathering together to eat on this day. They'd probably been this ongoing, silent negotiation amongst the people of where they were positioning themselves on the seating on the table for the food and how close they were to the host. That will have been played out in front of Jesus, in front of each other on this occasion. And Jesus here says the option really in life is not to seek the best seat, because you might end up being embarrassed, put to shame, he says. What we're meant to do is seek the lowest seat, and we may perhaps end up with a better seat, maybe even the best seat, one of glory and honor, when the host invites us. Now, of course, what's going on in the situation that's just played out in front of them was probably the exact opposite of that. I expect many of them were seeking the best seat, or certainly the best seat that they could have got, as close a place to the positions of honor at this uh, at this uh, at this mealtime, at this banquet, perhaps. But Jesus warns them that living this way, thinking that way, in this parable, he's saying, look, that self-promotion, that idea of self-promotion, of bigging yourself up, so to speak, in that way, is always going to be a temporary, transient thing. Better when you start low, you've got no place to go but up, friends. And that's not just Jesus saying this here now. There was a proverb in the Old Testament that also said something very similar. Proverbs 25 verses 6 and 7 says, "Do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he says to you, 'Come up here,' than have you put lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen." It's exactly what Jesus is teaching here, but he's doing it by parable. But it was taught in the Old Testament through Solomon, through the wisdom of this Old Testament proverb. So the point is simply this. What's going on here and positions in the table has nothing to do about manners. It's more to do with the eternal truth, and the eternal truth that's being revealed here and recommended here is the notion that we should always have an element of humility in how we approach everything we do. Be humble, as James says, and resist the proud, and he will give grace to the humble. So we need to learn to humble ourselves. Primarily, we need to learn to humble ourselves before God, but also before other people. Otherwise, we can be led to be, well, to come across as haughty. We'll actually be haughty and be high-minded and think too much of ourselves. Ironically, some people think they are humble and they're proud of their humility and they wear it like a badge. That's not what's been going on here. It's not about how you present it, it's a posture of the heart. True humility is an unconscious grace that comes from a sense of your own utter significance before the God of all creation and the realization of the wonderful grace of God in your life. It's not a sort of depreciation. It's not a sort of self-imposed depreciation of self. It is much more so just being in a position where you wholly appreciate God for who he is. Now, maybe these two things so far that Jesus has talked about here are related. Maybe if you're going to be truly compassionate, like he expressed, then in order to do that, in order to live that way, the way to access that compassionate spirit is just to be a little bit more humble in the way you live your life. You see, if you think less of yourself, I would suggest you're more likely to think more of other people. Maybe the problem is we think so much of ourselves that we often don't think of others at all. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever who humbles himself will be exalted, as it said. I remember just not very long ago, I had to really pick myself up on this when I was behind a lady in the supermarket, an elderly lady who took an eternity to struggle through her purse and find the correct money to pay the bill at the checkout in front of me. And then I realized, I laid before God my frustration in that situation because I was late for an appointment was with her, rather than seeing her as God seeing her as probably an elderly woman who lived on her own and struggled to do these sorts of tasks and do them quickly. So it's a case of thinking more about others, identifying with their position, and thinking a lot less about ourselves. I certainly needed to learn the lesson that day. Okay, he caps it off now with one more spiritual truth. Let's pick up the story in verse 12 through to 14, which is the end of what we're covering today. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brother or your sisters, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may of course invite you back, so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Now, he looks directly at the ruler of the synagogue, I would suggest, when he says this. And of course, there are these different dynamics that have been playing out for us in this passage. There's this guy, this prominent Pharisee, and there's these legal people, the scribes, the lawyers, and they've perhaps all been scrambling to get the best seats at the table. And now at this point, he turns to the hosts and says, when gathering together a group of people for a meal, don't just invite the great and the good. Don't just ask your friends, your brothers, your equals, your relatives, your neighbors who you're well disposed to, because it's likely they will invite you back. And maybe there's a sort of motivation underneath that you're going to be repaid back in the same way. And who was sitting at the table on this day when Jesus said that? Of course, all his friends, all the people he had invited, perhaps some high-ranking other Pharisees to show it off a little bit. And Jesus simply says, by doing it this way, well, in effect, you're kind of inviting the wrong crowd. Instead, he says, when you give a feast, make sure you also invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. Now, there's a significant lesson here. And by the way, it's not saying don't invite your friends and family. The point is making is don't only invite such people, which I think it can mean don't only invite the people who you already get on with. That's kind of what I think its application is for us today. You know, there are these things called cliques in life. And I think within a church, within a Christian community, within a group of believers who want to reach out and affect the lives of other people, cliques probably do more damage to hinder church and community growth than any other single thing. People come and they may be drawn even and are interested in a church, but they don't stay sometimes because they can't penetrate the cliques that exist in those places. We sometimes only mix with people who are our friends and family. Research shows that within 7 years of becoming a Christian, the vast majority of Christians, it's in the 90%, really only have a social life and Christian friends. They mix with people that they're comfortable with, like-minded people. Probably at the back of their mind, it can go beyond just the fact that they feel comfortable in that environment, but they believe that they will get that sort of social capital back in a sense. They get paid back by living in that social bubble in that way. So what we're called to do here, Jesus points out the need that we need to sort of back up a little, if you like, and make sure we stay in contact with people in the real world. If you really want to grasp what's going on here, the principle is that we shouldn't just be befriending people who are able to pay us back, either through friendships or with social capital, or even just with their influence. The ultimate call is to be a truly loving person expressing the love of God. We need to be a person that practices love, but a particular type of love, and that's the sacrificial love. A giving of love with no expectation of receiving anything back. And I think that's the ultimate, the core lesson at the dinner table here in this parable on this occasion. I'm going to quote for you a true story I read. I found it on Yahoo a few years ago on their news channel. And it tells the story. Well, the guy called William and Carol were a married couple, and their daughter, their only daughter, were planning a big wedding, and her daughter cancelled the wedding 1 month before she was set to walk down the aisle. The the parents were faced with this situation. They had a venue, food, entertainments, all of which they'd paid a 50% deposit on, all of which the contract said that if it was cancelled in less than a month, they would lose that deposit. So instead of cancelling anything, they decided that rather than just cancelling and losing the 50% upfront deposit, they changed the guest list and invited 200 homeless people. Now, Carol said in the Yahoo article, she said about a month prior to the wedding, we were made aware that we were no longer going to have the wedding. And then the idea of donating the reception came to us. We prayed about it, and when we woke up the next morning, we said, we're going to go ahead and do this, and we're going to call it the Feeding the Hungry Banquet. Yahoo News, when they reported it, entitled the article, The First Fowler Annual Family Celebration of Love, because the family says it plans to host. Uh, and after reading that, the family decided that they would indeed call it that, and they would plan to host such an event every year on that date thereafter. I think that's a wonderful example. I think that's a wonderful example of turning a bad situation into something positive and something that honours the Lord. Now, in respective applications of this passage to us today in our own individual Christian life and in the Christian circle of friends or even the church we belong to, the call is, of course, yeah, we need to love each other, right? That's taken as read. But the problem is we are too easily led down the path of just loving the people who love us. We also are called, we actually need to reach out and love, well, love the unlovable, love the people who don't and won't love us back. And that's what Jesus, I believe, is teaching at this parable at the close of this passage. That's what Jesus' heart lesson, if you like, is here, and it should be the thing that we try and take and apply in our lives. We should try and love the unlovely. And we do that in an unselfish, loving service of them, putting them first, supporting them, raising them up, because that here is what the Lord is saying we need to do. And if we do this, the truth is we may not get the benefit back from those people. They may not become our friends. Some might. Some may not even appreciate or value what we've done. They may just take it selfishly and use it. But if you reread the final verse, it says, we will be blessed because the fact is, in reality, they can't repay us. They won't necessarily bless us. So we will be repaid at the resurrection of the just, it says here. So there are two different things going on at one and the same time in this verse. You will be blessed, it's saying, but perhaps not now. So there is a promise of blessing here. But he said, so if it comes in this life, that's great, enjoy it. But for sure, you're going to be blessed at the resurrection of the just to come. So to sum it up, the background is Jesus invited to dinner, and he uses that everyday situation again as an opportunity to teach spiritual truths. And the thing he wants to get on this is the fact that we today need humility in our lives, because it is through that posture, that sense of humility, that we can begin to be compassionate for other people. We can begin to be concerned about other people, even perhaps to the point where we may sacrificially love other people. Okay, let me close today by making a couple of observations. As I said, Jesus didn't just talk in these situations, he taught. Jesus viewed all of life's opportunities as everything in life as an opportunity to illustrate a spiritual truth. Isn't that amazing? That's what he's done here. If you followed him around on that day, you would discover that everything that happened in his life, everything he saw was an opportunity to illustrate some sort of spiritual truth. Jesus saw everything as a potential to teach a lesson about God. So maybe one thing we can glean from this passage, from a sort of taking a helicopter perspective of it, is the fact that we too, as Christian believers, are called to be more sensitive to the spiritual truths that are all around us. And the second thing I would say is, on a practical level, we need to stop being self-absorbed. Instead of being self-absorbed, self-asserting, we need to be sensitive to the needs of other people. He who exalts himself in this life will be brought down to earth when the Lord, who knows the human heart, meets with us at the end of all things. Now, John, in his letter, that John, often called the Apostle of Love, in his letter, he reminds us of this. He says we are to love him because he first loved us. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar, for he does not love his brother whom he has seen. For if he does not love his brother who he has seen, then how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this is the command we have from him, but he who loves God must love his brother and sister also. So friends, may I suggest the bottom line in all of this is that we love the Lord, and we love the Lord more. We are to be, and in order to do that, we are to be humble in our lives. We are to be more humble, more sensitive, and more concerned about other people in all our interactions and lives. Many years ago, there was a story of a church service that was held in London, and just at the beginning of the service, the man who pumped the bellows for the organ became ill. That's how it was done originally. Now, today, of course, if we do have an organ in a church, it's likely pumped electronically by electronic bellows that will be hidden underneath the organ or at the back of the organ somewhere. A very famous composer was visiting the church that week at that time when the organ assistant became ill. A guy called Handel. I'm sure you've heard of him, the writer of the Messiah. And he, immediately realizing what has happened, stepped forward and took his place and pumped the bellows so that the service could continue. Later, when some of his friends heard about what has happened, they criticized the composer and they said, "Why would you stoop to such commonplace work and do such a commonplace thing?" Handel's reply was, "Nothing I could do for the Lord would ever seem commonplace to me." Friends, the call upon us from this passage, from the life and ministry of Christ itself, is there. It's illustrated for us, a call to humility and a call to service and a call to love. And thanks be to God for that. I'll leave it there today. Great to have been with you again today. Remember, we're working through the entire Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. This is not a rush through the Bible in a one-year plan. This is a plan to cover the whole text of the Bible, however long it takes. And I do hope you're enjoying being with me to it. New posts are on the Bible Project Daily podcast on this project are put up pretty much Monday to Friday every week. There may be the odd day that needs to get dropped just through time pressure. But of course, you're free to do it live with me, or even consider why not go back to the very beginning, and that way you'll cover the whole Bible and do it whatever pace that suits you. Some people I know earlier on, the episodes were a bit shorter, so they're rushing through several episodes a day and playing catch up. But that's not necessary. You just do it at the pace that suits you and that the Word of God ministers to you best. Just as an extra, I'll just notify you of a new podcast that if you're listening to this live in early February 2024, that my latest podcast, which is a history of the Christian Church, is existing on the historical genre sections of all the main podcast networks now. We're 2 episodes in now, and the plan is that to do that Christian evangelical work, but do it in a way where it can exist over in the secular environment of the historical podcasts. Between you and me, it's a history of the church. In reality, it's a history of the work of the God through the lives and the thinking and the application of the Word of God through the lives in all the main Christian thinkers, as I see it over 2,000 years now. Hopefully, that podcast will become self-sustaining through people who are interested in receiving it, paying forward, or supporting that podcast over there. That way, we're reaching a much wider network of people than just those, because pretty much you guys, I would assume, you must be pretty much committed Christian believers, or you wouldn't even be joining me on this journey, although everybody's welcome. So the big thing is, thanks for being here. Why not follow the link in this episode notes to the History of the Christian Church podcast. Check that out, see if it interests you, and maybe even share it with friends who aren't believers and just say it's a really interesting history podcast. So with that all said, thanks for joining me. Remember, there are lots of ways you can connect to this ministry. You can become a partner, a Patreon, you can support it, or you can just really happy for you just to be part of this journey with me, because it's blessing you. Everything I do is in the public domain, copyright free for you to use in whatever way you want. Even the episode notes and the transcripts I put on there of what I've said, they're all free for you to use. And I'm able to do that because of the people who have decided to partner with this ministry in enabling me to offer and keep this free and keep it out there. So thanks to them, thanks to you, and I do trust I'll see you back here again very soon. Bye-bye for now.